If you've clicked on this video, you're probably aware of the Resident Evil 4 Remake announcement trailer. If not, their blog post states, Resident Evil 4 is a remake of the 2005 original Resident Evil 4. When it first came out, Resident Evil 4 revolutionized the Resident Evil franchise, with its new game style that combined action, shooting, and resource management elements, subsequently setting the standard for future Resident Evil titles. In my opinion, the game was so ahead of its time that it still holds up against current releases.
Long time no see.
The game has such a dedicated fan base that fans have remastered the game under the name Resident Evil HD Project. The graphical remaster contains enhanced textures, 3D models, menus, cutscenes, pre-rendered videos, lighting, visual effects and more.
Lord Sadorā, please bless us with your next order.
I myself was compelled to make a video about the origins of Resident Evil 4's village after replaying the game last year.
Benevolent people.
Coincidentally, 1 year later, a remake was announced. Since the original game is playable on modern hardware, I have never personally felt the need for a remake of Resident Evil 4. However, I understand that the original might not be as accessible for newer audiences. The way Leon moves and turns may look a little stiff compared to modern titles. The colours and textures used in certain areas may look a little grey and repetitive. Also, the game is quite bright for a horror game. But it's no secret that the game was a slight sidestep from Resident Evil's survival horror roots, in favour of fast-paced, heart-pounding action. There is also a problem with the way the PC version handles frame rates. It can make the button mashing sequences almost impossible for people playing above 30Hz. Looking back to the official PlayStation blog, they say, this time the game is being developed to achieve state-of-the-art quality for a survival horror suitable for 2023, while preserving the essence of the original game. We aim to make the game familiar to fans of the series, while also providing a fresh feeling to it. This is being done by reimagining the storyline of the game while keeping the essence of its direction, modernising the graphics and updating the controls to a modern standard. It's interesting that they mention the game is being developed to achieve state-of-the-art quality for survival horror. The original game often had a comedic tone, with Leon flirting with people and various characters exchanging wisecracks with our protagonist.
Okay. I have only one very important question. You got a smoke?
With the mention of survival horror, perhaps the game will have a more serious tone, and we know the game will be made using the RE engine, which I personally think runs great on current and older hardware, with the exception of the framerate drop some people experienced in Resident Evil 8 Village. Speaking of Resident Evil Village, I feel like parts of the game were directly taking influence and trying to recreate the magic of Resident Evil 4's Village from the early game. I don't think the game really succeeded in paying tribute to Resident Evil 4, and I found the rehash of Resident Evil 4's visual storytelling in the credits a bit reductive. The blog also mentions Leon. He tracks Ashley to a secluded European village where there is something terribly wrong with the villagers, and the curtain raises on this story of grueling survival horror and rescue. The blog highlights the village and the villagers, so I think the game will focus and spend more time in the village, perhaps painting an even more sympathetic view of the villagers, while playing the game rather than saving that for the end credits and supplemental novel. The curtain rises presumably refers to Sadorā's plot to indoctrinate the villagers and control them via the Las Plagas. If you're interested in RE4's origin story, please watch my Resident Evil 4 Incubate video, where I unpack the backstory to the original game. Now we have looked at the blog entry, it's time we talked about the trailer itself. First off, I would like to note the use of a Spanish sounding guitar. Which is a nod to one of the first pieces of music we hear in the original game. It could hint at a larger focus of this town being in Spain, and not just the more generic European village we saw in the first game. Then we have some footage of Leon meeting the President of the United States. This clip seems to be here to tie the game back to Netflix's Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, a series that I'm not particularly interested in. It doesn't do any harm, and I guess everything has to be part of a multiverse these days. It's interesting that Leon's jacket in the remake looks more like it did in the beta versions of the original game. More on those later. Another brief thing I'd like to note is the colour tones seem to be dark with blue hues. Gone are the reds and browns which featured a lot in the original and on the now iconic box art. Notice how this deer has a bite taken out of its cheek. Hopefully this is a wolf or a zombie and not a fucking werewolf.
What the hell?
One thing I'll point out is that this trailer features a lot of Los Iluminados symbols, and it gives us a look at the cultists. I don't immediately love their design. The image I have burned in my brain is of the original hooded monks with their black and red robes and tattoos on their head. But we see them so briefly it's hard to say what they'll look like in their setting. We see Father Bitores Mendez standing menacingly at the end of a corridor. Father Mendez was a Catholic priest whose parish was in the village. However, in the game he is converted to Los Iluminados and serves as terrorist Osmond Sadler's first lieutenant. In the trailer, Mendez is wearing a Capello Romano, and his medallion is shining in the light. The addition of a hat reinforces his former life as a priest, as well as making him more intimidating. I'm getting a lot of Jack from Resident Evil 7 vibes from this encounter. Perhaps Father Mendez will be an unstoppable force at the beginning of the game, similar to Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. Speaking of the village, notice how this emblem looks similar to the one used in Village. They may be trying to link the two cults. At the end of the trailer, there is the shadowy silhouette of Osmond Sadler. He says, "You will receive our sacred body. It begins now."
You will receive our most sacred body. It begins now.
He could be talking to either Ashley or Leon, but I will assume that both become infected in the game. The game may put more emphasis on their infection, similar to how the mold affects Ethan in Resident Evil 7 and 8, where he gains new abilities such as his regenerative powers. Now we have seen what the trailer has to offer, please allow me to speculate for a moment. Although I love the castle sections, I would like to see more experimentation. Some of the set pieces are probably too absurd to include in the remake, but I hope they try to include them or create entirely new spectacles to fit into the modern Resident Evil canon. The Resident Evil franchise is becoming less and less grounded and leaning towards the supernatural. I'm referring to the 10-foot tall vampires, werewolves, and floating puppets. Yes, I know these things are explained away as being superhuman rather than supernatural. I would actually welcome more unnatural elements, such as the addition of the paranormal. Early versions of Resident Evil 4 had such enemies. You may have seen screenshots of multiple early builds of the game. Let's talk about these versions and see if there are any elements the remake could borrow. The earliest version of the game is dubbed the Fog version. Announced in 2002, the Fog version saw Leon, having infiltrated the castle, being pursued by a shadowy entity. Leon is infected by the progenitor virus and possesses a hidden power in his left hand. This game also featured first-person elements. I think it would be interesting to see this featured in Resident Evil 4's remake, perhaps during the sections where you play as the helpless Ashley in the original. This would be a happy medium for people who prefer the first-person games over the third-person ones. The second revision of the game is known as the Hookman version. This story was set in a haunted castle where Leon is once again infected. He encounters a paranormal figure with a large hook for a hand. Other enemies we would have encountered were animated suits of armours that featured in the final release, and possessed dolls similar to the ones that appear in Resident Evil Village. This version doesn't look like a traditional Resident Evil title. The camera glitches and distorts, and there's a blue hue when ghosts are encountered. This is something you'd more likely see in a Silent Hill game. Also, is that a moose's head? The third beta is known as the Hallucination version. This version continues on from the Huken Castle version. Leon experiences hallucinations due to the virus. He infiltrates the castle of Spencer, where he encounters a young girl accompanied by a dog who is a BOW. The two start to make their way up the castle. There's not much to say about this version. Some elements were used in the DLC for Resident Evil 5. On a side note, it's interesting that Devil May Cry came from an early incarnation of Resident Evil 4. Developers felt that the cool and stylized action-adventure game wouldn't fit in the world of Resident Evil. Mikami felt it strayed too far from the series' survival horror roots, and gradually convinced staff to make an independent game. It's quite ironic considering the direction the franchise went after this point. Shinji Mikami himself recently admitted that he didn't have a lot of time to come up with the story for Resident Evil 4, and wrote it in just 3 weeks. I really hope the developers of this game consult Mikami, or at the very least look at some of the concepts that they were unable to include in the original. That being said, the developers are the people responsible for the excellent Resident Evil 2 remake, and not the developers behind Resident Evil 3 remake, so I think we're in good hands.
Get down!